In this screencast, I'm going to talk about control of respiration. I'm going to focus on local control, since that tends to be the concept people have the hardest time with. Remember in class we talked about how, unless you have a lung disease, we never use our lungs to their full capacity. So what that means is when you take a breath in, airflow is not going to go to all the alveoli. And because of that, blood flow has to be controlled too, because you don't want to be sending blood to an area of alveoli that don't have sufficient oxygen or sufficient air. So how can the lungs control this? They can do it through two different mechanisms. One is through the bronchioles, which remember lead into the alveoli, and they can constrict or dilate and control airflow. And arterioles, which are blood vessels that can also constrict or dilate, they can control blood flow into the capillaries that go to the alveoli. So it goes arterioles and then capillaries. So if the arterioles dilate or constrict, it controls the blood flow into the capillaries that go to the alveoli. Let's start with blood flow. One thing you have to memorize is, and you need to understand, is that oxygen in the alveoli controls blood flow to the alveoli. So oxygen controls blood flow to the arterioles. Now this should make some logical sense. If you just think through it logically, you shouldn't have to memorize as much. If our oxygen level in the alveoli is low, do you want to send blood to those alveoli? Remember what the purpose is here. We're trying to get oxygen into the blood supply and we're trying to get CO2 out. So do you want to send blood flow to the alveoli that are low in oxygen? And the answer is no, you don't. So what's going to happen is the arterioles are going to constrict, what's called vasoconstriction, which means less blood will get into the capillaries, and that means less blood goes to these alveoli. So oxygen level controls arterioles. Now let's look at it the other side of it. If oxygen levels in the alveoli go up, do you want blood flow going to those alveoli? And the answer is yes, you do. So what will happen is the arterioles will dilate, sending more blood flow into these capillaries, which means more blood can pick up this oxygen, which is what we want to happen. So oxygen levels in the alveoli control what the arterioles do and controls the amount of blood that goes into the alveoli. So perfusion. Perfusion is a general term dealing with blood flow to any area. We're specifically dealing with blood flow to alveoli. So the oxygen levels in the alveoli control the blood flow going to the alveoli. So again, if you have low oxygen in the alveoli, you'll get decreased blood flow to those alveoli. Why? Because there's not a lot of oxygen there. So there's no reason to really send a large amount of blood to that area. On the other side, if you have a high oxygen in the alveoli, you're going to get an increased blood flow to those alveoli. Why? Because you want to pick up that oxygen. That's the goal, is to pick up oxygen, bring it into the blood supply. So if you have high oxygen in the alveoli, then you're going to get increased blood flow to those alveoli to pick up that oxygen. This is the form I gave you, the concept map. You should be able to fill this out based on what I went over in class and what you just heard. Now let's look at airflow. What's going to control airflow is the bronchioles. What controls what bronchioles do is the amount of carbon dioxide in the alveoli. So carbon dioxide levels control what the bronchioles do. So if the carbon dioxide level is low in the alveoli, is there really any great need to get rid of a lot of air in this alveoli? And the answer is no. Remember, we want to get carbon dioxide out of the body, and we do that by breathing it out. So if there's not a lot of carbon dioxide in the alveoli, there's really not a need to get rid of that air immediately. So the bronchioles to those alveoli will constrict. Now let's look at the other side. If CO2 levels are high in the alveoli, do we want to get rid of the air in that alveoli? And the answer is yeah, we do. We want to get rid of this CO2. So what's going to happen is the bronchioles are going to dilate, breathe out that air, and we get rid of the waste product carbon dioxide. So again, carbon dioxide levels in the alveoli control what the bronchioles do. So that's ventilation. Carbon dioxide in the alveoli controls the bronchioles. Increased carbon dioxide, bronchioles will dilate, let more air and carbon dioxide out of the body. Decreased carbon dioxide in the alveoli, not as necessary or not as critical to get that air out, so the bronchioles will constrict. So by going through these two processes, you kind of balance out where blood flow is going and where you're getting rid of air. Again, I gave you this form. After listening in class and going through this podcast or screencast, you should be able to fill out these blanks. Now let's look at the question we did in class and just review it, just in case you didn't understand it when we did it. This can seem somewhat overwhelming, but if you take it in parts, it's really not that hard. So let's look at what happens when oxygen levels are low. And again, we're talking oxygen levels in the alveoli. When oxygen levels are low, what happens? Do we want to send a lot of blood flow to an area where there's not a lot of oxygen? And the answer is no, we don't. So when oxygen levels are low, what's going to happen to blood flow? It's going to decrease. So let's look at our choices. This one can't be right because it says blood flow increases. This one could be right because it says blood flow decreases. And this one could be right because blood flow decreases. So we've eliminated 1 and we've eliminated 3. Now look at the second part of the question. When carbon dioxide levels are high. If carbon dioxide levels are high, what do we want to do with that air? We want to get rid of it. So what are bronchioles going to do? Bronchioles are going to dilate to let that air out. So our choices were 2 and 4. 2 is not an answer because the bronchioles here, it says the bronchioles constrict. So the only answer that is right for both parts of the question is number 4. So again, take the question, break it down into parts, and you should have an easier time. So again, review all these concepts and make sure you understand them before the test.